Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace. I'm your host Mohammed Salih, and I'm glad you are with us for another edition of the New Regions bi-weekly podcast, where we unpack the fast-changing dynamics of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Meghan Bodette, Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington, D.C. Meghan has spent years covering Kurdish affairs with multiple research trips to Rojava and northeast Syria. And she's in fact joining us fresh from another visit to Syria. We'll be discussing Syria's northeast, the situation there, the broader minority question in the country, and the regional and international forces shaping the future of Syria. Before we start, a quick reminder, you can find GeoSpace on the New Regions website under the Watch section, as well as on YouTube and SoundCloud. And while we are talking about the website, you'll also find there our extensive coverage of the situation in Syria over the past several months. Meghan, welcome to GeoSpace. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for the invite, Mohammed.
Sure. You have been to Syria multiple times, both before and after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime. What are the most striking changes you have observed between the pre- and post-Assad eras?
Well, I think to answer this question, it's important to remember that for Syrian Kurds in the northeast, the Assad regime actually fell in July of 2012, which was when Kurds pushed regime forces out of Kobani, Afrin, and the Jazeera region around Qamishlo. And from that day forward, there has been a level of self-governance in the Northeast that ultimately turned into the Democratic Autonomous Administration, or DAANES, and there have also been local security forces that formed into the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF. So when the regime fell, of course, Syrian Kurds and all of the communities in the Northeast were very happy to see the end of a brutal dictatorship that had done so much harm to them and their countrymen. But the reality was that the people of the Northeast had been building a post-Assad future for over a decade by December of 2024. And what that meant on the ground is that after the fall of the regime, we saw that the political structures that had existed since 2012 were in place. The local government, that recognizes all religions, all languages, that grants equal rights for women, is still in place. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are made up of Kurds, Arabs, Christians, and other communities of the Northeast, are still right where they are, defending their communities. And so this situation really tells us, I think, that while for much of Syria, what we've seen since December has been a process of rebuilding after dictatorship, what we're seeing in the Northeast now in this political transition is an effort to preserve the rights and freedoms on things like language rights, religious freedom, equality for women, and decentralized governance where security is in the hands of local people that have already existed for close to 15 years.
You just returned from Syria yesterday, I believe. Can you describe the current mood in northeast Syria, especially among minorities, given the shifting political and security landscape in that country? How do people actually view the new government and post-Assad Syria?
As I said, the Kurdish, Christian, and Yazidi communities of the Northeast are, of course, happy to see the brutal Arab nationalist Assad regime gone. At the same time, they're used to having the freedom to speak their own language. They're used to having the freedom to practice their religion. And particularly after the massacres of the Alawite community in coastal regions and the Druze community in Sueda, they're afraid that not only might they lose these hard-won rights and freedoms, but they may once again be forced to flee for their lives as they were forced to flee when ISIS came. I spoke to people who stuck out the entire conflict, who stayed through ISIS attacks, through 2 Turkish interventions, who are now talking about potentially leaving Syria if they don't get a fair deal to preserve their rights through integration, which was really devastating to hear. There is, on the one hand, that fear that exists. There is an incredible sense of resolve to protect things like language rights, religious freedom, decentralized governance, and local control of security, all conditions that make life possible for minority communities. And despite all of these challenges, there's a real belief in diplomacy as well. When I asked people if any positive views of the transitional government they might have, people said, well, at least they're negotiating. At least they don't think that they can attack us. And what everyone in Northeast Syria wants, no matter their ethnicity or religion, is a peaceful political solution to the Syrian crisis based on decentralization and equal rights. That's what they've been asking for since 2014, when the autonomous administration was established. They weren't able to achieve that with the former regime, and they hope to achieve it through this process with the new state. But particularly after what we've seen of the new state's treatment of minority communities, there are some serious concerns.
Right. We have also seen reports recently of pressure from Damascus and Ankara on the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, to integrate into Syria's new military, and for the autonomous administration in the northeast also to integrate into the governing bodies of the new government in Damascus. And we saw that President Ahmed al-Shara and SDF General Commander Mazloum Abdi signed an agreement to that effect back in March, with a deadline for the reintegration to happen by the end of 2025. But we haven't really seen much integration happening. What is holding up this, reintegration or integration process between the Northeast and Damascus?
I think that there are 2 factors that are causing the delays here. One is that, well, the visions for the future of Syria held by the Northeast, the SDF and Democratic Autonomous Administration, and by the transitional government in Damascus are extremely different. In Northeast Syria, men and women have equal rights, and women actually hold 50% of leadership positions. Under the transitional government, very few women are represented in political leadership. Women have no role in the security forces at all. And we saw in Idlib under HTS rule that women were essentially second-class citizens. As I mentioned, Northeast Syria has enshrined religious freedom in its social contract, which functions as its constitution, with protections for Christian, Yazidi communities, and for all religions and beliefs. The transitional government comes from a group rooted in radical Islamist ideas. And we've seen in its approach to communities that are not Sunni Arab that it has a real intolerance for true religious pluralism. One major achievement of the system in the Northeast is the revitalization of the Kurdish language. Kurdish is an official language in Northeast Syria for the first time in the history of the Syrian Kurdish community. You can go through an entire day really only using the Kurdish language at all. And then the transitional government has attempted to claim that it's taking, meaningful steps on the issues of Kurdish rights by doing things like publishing Syrian state news in Kurdish, which is really not anything that Kurdish communities were actually asking for, while maintaining only Arabic as the official language in the constitution. So there are some big differences. There's a fundamental difference on centralization versus decentralization, with the Northeast wanting a decentralized system and the transitional government creating a draft constitutional declaration that gives President al-Shara, extreme personalized power, not just centralized power in Damascus. But even putting aside all of these issues, because even big problems can be solved at a negotiating table, particularly in a situation like Syria, where everybody is tired of war. At the end of the day, Turkey's role is a serious obstacle to this reconciliation. And until Turkey can accept Syrian Kurds getting the rights and all components in Syria getting their rights, I think it'll be very difficult for these negotiations to progress.
What do you think this insistence on centralization, creating a centralized unitary state in Syria, is coming from, as far as Damascus is concerned? Do they really think that is the best path or, course of action forward? Is it something that they believe in Damascus, or, are they doing this mostly under pressure from Ankara, on which they depend greatly? For all sorts of things from trade and commerce to security and military partnerships.
As I said, I think that Turkey's role is pivotal in holding up these negotiations. Look, you read the press release that came out where the transitional government pulled out of the Paris negotiations, which were supposed to take place between the SDF and the transitional government with French and other international mediation. That press release read as though it had just been Google translated from Turkish, right? That was very obviously written in Ankara and sent to Syria to be given out. Turkey right now is in a negotiation process with its own Kurdish movement, and they are of the belief that if Syria grants rights to the Kurdish community and creates a decentralized political system, that they will be under pressure to give those same things to the Kurdish population within Turkey as part of their own negotiations with the PKK. And right now, Turkey appears unprepared to do that. So I think that Turkish pressure is perhaps the most significant factor pushing for centralization, because in reality, Syria's new government does not have the power to run a politically and militarily centralized state. Even the areas under their control and the forces that they claim to have integrated into their army, we see that the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army militias still run their own affairs, still largely, engage in the kind of behaviors that they were engaging in before, and are essentially, still in their previous command structure. We see that tribal militias have been mobilized and that the government is either unable to stop them or unwilling to stop them, both of which suggest serious issues with command and control. And, everything I've heard, I haven't personally been to Damascus, but speaking to people who have, they say that you don't feel as though there is a state when you travel through government-held areas, whether you're safe and secure or in serious danger simply because of your ethnicity is entirely a matter of who it is that happens to be on the checkpoint that you're approaching. So the government just doesn't have the capability to force its system on a country as historically, as civilizationally diverse as Syria. It doesn't have the military power to run one centralized army, even in the territory that it controls. So there's no way that it's going to reintegrate the Northeast without some kind of decentralization. Ideology aside, it's just not practical. So I think Turkish pressure is the biggest obstacle. Certainly the extremely authoritarian Islamist ideology of HTS is a problem, but I think Syria's new leaders are pragmatic enough to realize that they can't take all of the country by force, and integrating through a process of, decentralization is the best way to actually put the country back together. And without, I think, some of these foreign influences, that might be much more possible than it is today.
I assume during your stay in Northeast Syria, you have had conversations with SDF and the Autonomous Administration's leadership. Have you been able to gather, whether in terms of their negotiations with Damascus, when it comes in particular to the integration of the SDF into the new Syrian military, does Damascus really insist on the SDF being integrated as, individuals on the basis of individual fighters and soldiers, or is Damascus ready to hand the SDF a deal similar to what it handed to other former Syrian opposition groups, including, the division or legions of foreign jihadis, whereby they were integrated as a whole block into the new military, kind of preserving their existing command structure in place? What have you been able to, gather on that?
Well, from what I've heard, Damascus is still insisting on this individual integration, which, as you brought up, is the opposite of the terms that it gave to many other armed groups that are smaller than the SDF, less capable than the SDF, and as you said, in some cases, not even representative of Syrian society, in terms of these foreign groups that have been integrated. So this creates a real sense of unfairness. And it also raises real questions about whether even there is a unified Syrian army with which the SDF can integrate. Because, the SDF has a command structure. It is to some degree decentralized. It includes many different groups with different sort of internal structures or special characteristics. Many people will have heard of the YPJ, or the Women's Defense Units, which is an all-female force within the SDF. There is the Syriac Christian force within the SDF. There is a Armenian force within the SDF. So groups with their own particularities all function under one unified command. Now, what Damascus has isn't that. What Damascus has is core HTS, plus these Syrian National Army groups that are still fully under their own command structures, including with leaders from these groups who have been accused of serious human rights abuses being integrated into senior military posts wholesale. There are foreign jihadists, there are tribal militias. There isn't one professional, disciplined, unified armed force for the SDF to integrate with. So if they want the SDF to dissolve, one wants to ask what they're going to do. Will they send some of these well-trained, fighters who are used to a professional armed force that protects all citizens? Will they put some with the SNA and some with the tribes and some with the foreign jihadists? Individual integration, particularly into what is now the Syrian army, is just completely unworkable. And I think that, as particularly, the international community is looking at these negotiations, they should be trying to ensure that Syria gains from the experience that the SDF has and from the organization and structure that they have that's been proven to work. And they're not going to be able to do that if they simply want to scatter these fighters throughout their very undisciplined army that has serious problems with extremism and accountability. So that's where these negotiations are at this point in time. And for all the reasons I mentioned, it doesn't look like very much progress is on the horizon here.
Right. Do you like when it comes to the threats that are being made by Damascus and Ankara, and we see, the tone of threats sort of ebb and flow, but they have been consistent in demanding integration. I wonder, like, what is your understanding of the eventual situation here, or the end game in a way? If push comes to shove, will the SDF actually hand over their weapons, or do you think, that they will hold their ground and put up a fight and are not going to accept to be subdued, at least without a fight, to Damascus and Ankara by extension?
I think, as I said, that the SDF, the Autonomous Administration, and the society of the Northeast, the 4 million people who live there, are committed to peace and diplomacy. I also think that while they may make threats, HTS and Turkey do not want an all-out war. It is not in their interest. For HTS, or the transitional government, an all-out war would mean, new civil war in Syria, potentially even the end of their status as Syria's ruling body. For Turkey, it would mean the end of their peace process with the PKK, and the end of any possible both domestic and international advantages that Erdogan and his government are hoping to gain from those negotiations. So an all-out war is a lose-lose situation, despite the escalation in rhetoric that has been seen in recent weeks. But look, I'll tell you, I had the chance to go to Kobani for a music and art festival put on by the local arts and culture authorities. They run a summer program so that kids can, learn arts, music, painting, drawing, all of these different skills. And seeing these children, performing Kurdish songs, drawing pictures of their hometown, famous landmarks like the Kurdish flags in Kobani, like the statue of Aryan Mir Khan, a YPJ fighter who, courageously gave her own life rather than allow her comrades to be captured by ISIS. You realize they've only known a world where they're free. They've only known a world where being able to go to school in Kurdish or sing a song in Kurdish or draw a Kurdish symbol is not just allowed, but is accepted and promoted. They've only known a world where the city of Kobani was governed by the people of Kobani themselves. There's an entire generation now in Northeast Syria that only remembers decentralized local governance, local control of security, the right to speak their language, the right to practice their religion. And then the older generation at the same time, you meet with people who spent the 1980s and 1990s organizing undercover for Kurdish rights, despite the threats of the regime. They saw how far they had to come to get here. They know what it's like to live under a regime that doesn't grant you the basic freedoms to govern yourself and practice your own culture. So the entire society is not in a position to be willing to give any of this up. They want peace, they want to integrate, but they will not lose the rights and freedoms that they fought so hard to gain and that have become, for a large number of people, not something exceptional, but just a part of normal life. The same way that you and I enjoy these rights and freedoms in the United States or in any other country, that doesn't have these problems with massive civil war. So that's not something that's taken away easily. And I think that if the transitional government in Turkey are short-sighted enough to begin a large-scale conflict, that conflict will be very difficult for everyone and will not, be necessarily, something that ends in the way that they would have hoped for it to end.
That's a really interesting point, Megan. And from my own conversations with other folks interested in Syria, whether other analysts, journalists, or even government officials here in the U.S., and also from following what's happening in Damascus and the rhetoric coming out of there. My own impression often is that a lot of people, do not really understand the change that has happened on the ground, in the Kurdish parts of Syria, in the northeast in general. That basically any young person in their early to mid 20s have come to grow up under this Kurdish-run entity. And they have gone just as you described, from the generation of their parents, where not only anti-state political activity was banned and forbidden, but also any expression of Kurdish culture was basically criminalized and made illegal by the Assad regime. Do you have that sense that by not really having that on the ground understanding of the shift, of this generational shift that has occurred in the Northeast, in Rojava, that is one of the things that pushes people, whether in Damascus or even the U.S. Officials involved in Syria and Ankara as well, to not really grasp the enormity of the change and try to respond to that rather than insisting on some, old 20th century type of rhetoric about centralized state rule and, somehow criminalization of Kurdish culture and language.
That's absolutely a part of it. Personally, as somebody who is a fluent Kurdish speaker and who's spent significant time on the ground, I think that anybody who did engage with this society in a substantive way would understand that they have radically changed their society and political system in the years since they achieved autonomy in 2012, and that there is no tolerance for giving up any of the rights and freedoms that they have gained. One thing that we try to do at the Kurdish Peace Institute with our office on the ground, in our connections in the local community and with local government and civil society, is to make sure that people can access information about real conditions and real perspectives And I think that we wouldn't be able to do that without the presence on the ground, the language skills, and the cultural knowledge. So I think what we're seeing here is part of a wider problem in Washington, D.C., where, you have people making decisions, about places and issues where they don't have the basic cultural skills to be able to go out and order a sandwich on the street, right? And that isn't only a problem in Syria. We see this kind of all over the world. But, in Syria, this is really manifested in such a way as to become, not just ignorance, but actual information deficit on an issue that is critical to US and regional security and stability. I think that more familiarity with Syrian Kurdish society and with the situation in the Northeast is something that would help, analysts and policymakers make better decisions about what the future, of that region and of Syria as a whole could look like. Because, any policy that is predicated on this, like you said, 20th century idea of unitary nation states with only one language and one culture and one identity, this is simply not going to work in Syria. The Assad regime tried to create that kind of, ultra-nationalist, ultra-centralized state. It failed. Syrian Kurds resisted that type of state when it was the regime attempting to impose it on them. And they will resist this new state if it tries to impose that same type of government. But again, with these negotiations, there is a possibility for things to be different. And I'll always go back to this. What I think everybody wants, first and foremost, is peace.
Right. I wonder how the Kurdish unity efforts in northeast Syria are currently going. There was a conference back in March between, that brought together the representatives of the Democratic Union Party, which is the main political party in the autonomous administration of northeast Syria, and the Kurdish National Council. And they signed onto a paper of a political vision for the future of Kurds and that entire region and how to negotiate with Damascus. But in practice, what I've noticed is whenever there is any negotiation that is happening between northeast and Damascus, it is either SDF officials or the autonomous administration's officials going there, and the other Kurdish groups' role, in particular the KNC's, does not seem to be to be there really. What can you tell us about how are these Kurdish unity efforts going in the region?
So I can tell you that I was in Qamishlo in January when that meeting between General Mazloum Abdi and former Kurdistan Region President Masoud Barzani took place. People were celebrating in the streets. This is something that Kurdish society, not just in northeast Syria, but across the region, has been hoping for a long time. It's also a real display of the fact that issues like decentralization, language rights, and community control of security aren't only a demand of the PYD or the autonomous administration, they are a cross-partisan Kurdish, community or national demand. And so it's very unfortunate that the new Syrian transitional government has refused to meet with the Kurdish delegation. The information that I've heard suggests that the reasons why that delegation created out of that unity agreement, which includes members of the PYD, the KNC, and other Kurdish parties, has not been able to go to Damascus because the transitional government will not meet with them. It only accepts meetings with the SDF and the autonomous administration. I can't give any concrete reason why that would be, but my assessment of what could be a reason is the fact that the government and some of its allies, including Turkey, benefit from being able to cast Kurdish demands as a partisan issue and not a Kurdish national issue, common to Kurds across the political spectrum. I think that they know that if they met with this joint delegation, they would be admitting that what Syrian Kurds want is, not something dictated by political parties or certain political perspectives, but it's a demand shared across political perspectives, including by parties like the KNC that actually have a good relationship with Turkey. So I think that they see a political threat from a unified Kurdish position, and in this way maybe don't want to engage there. But it's had really positive impacts, in other ways. We see that, for example, Kurdish media, which is often very partisan, has very much softened in its coverage of, other political parties. We see that the community is very happy with this as well. I've met with Kurdish families who have relatives fighting in the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga, in the PKK in Turkey, and in the Syrian Kurdish forces. So seeing these political parties and movements, that claim to represent Kurdish goals actually working together has given a lot of, I think, strength and enthusiasm to Syrian Kurdish society. And so no matter whether Damascus meets with that delegation or not, I think that these improved relations with Kurdish parties that we're seeing, in Syria, but also in the context of the Turkish-Kurdish peace process, will be something positive for Kurdish politics at the regional level.
Another important issue for the Kurds in the region is the fate of the many Kurds who have been, stripped of citizenship ever since 1960s. We have now had, several generations of those families who, have also come to not have the Syrian citizenship, even though they have lived in Syria since, the early 20th century at least. What do you know about the efforts between the authorities in northeast Syria and Damascus in terms of restoring citizenship to these Kurds? And I wonder if you have any figures in terms of how many Kurds are there? What is the number of the Kurds who do not have Syrian citizenship still?
I don't have that figure on hand, but I do know that the restoration of Kurdish citizenship is a demand of the autonomous administration and of, every Syrian Kurdish political party today. Now, in the March 10th agreement, the Syrian government recognized for the first time of any Syrian government that the Kurdish community is an integral part of, the Syrian community and state, and promised to grant Kurds all of their constitutional rights. Now, necessarily, those acknowledgements would mean that they would, be obligated by that agreement to restore the citizenship of those Kurdish communities. But that has not been done yet. The government appears to have been too busy with steps like, creating a parliament where many members will be handpicked by the president and others will be elected by committees handpicked by the president, or by, going after these Alawite and Druze communities, integrating armed groups with records of serious human rights abuses into the army. The government has taken a lot of steps that haven't been so constructive, instead of focusing on things that would really be gestures of unity and pluralism, like restoring citizenship to Kurdish communities. And I think overall we're seeing a lack of progress on those issues in the March 10th agreement pertaining to Kurdish legal and constitutional rights that is very concerning for the integration process. For example, many Kurds were expecting that mention of legal and constitutional rights in the March 10th agreement would mean the new constitutional declaration would recognize the Kurdish language. It didn't do that. It only recognized the Arabic language. The name of the state has remained the Syrian Arab Republic, which many Kurds and other ethnic minorities in Syria too see as erasure. So with the government putting out that kind of constitutional declaration just days after the March 10th agreement, and then really failing to even talk about the actions that it might take on key Kurdish constitutional and legal demands in the future, and instead taking steps that have been centralizing, divisive, and often very threatening to Kurdish communities. I'm not optimistic that this issue will be resolved soon, which is a shame because it would be something truly transformative for the Syrian state to do, to show that it was, truly moving past and rectifying the Assad regime's abuses.
Another critical issue here is also the fate of the Afrin region and the local population, the Kurds, Yazidis, Christians, and others who were subjected to gross human rights, abuses and atrocities by the Syrian National Army, the former opposition group that is backed by Turkey. And I know that you have researched Afrin quite closely for years. I wonder how had the situation there evolved since Assad's fall. We know that the transitional president Ahmed al paid a visit to Afrin in February, and he promised, full normalization in that region. But how had that, normalization process really been going so far? And have they restored all the properties of the Kurds who were, that were forcibly taken from them? Or the local population is still dealing with serious challenges in that regard?
So the most important thing that has happened in Afrin since the fall of the regime is that Kurdish families have started to return because the families of members of Turkish-backed armed groups and other people moved into the region by Turkey in order to change its demographics following the 2018 invasion and occupation, have started to return to their home regions in other parts of Syria that were previously under regime control. So this is positive. Any return of an ethnically cleansed community to their homeland is something worth celebrating. But the problem is that they're doing this without any support from the new authorities. There isn't an organized process by which people moved into stolen homes and properties after 2018 are being moved out of those regions. This means, of course, that not all of them have left. It also means that many of them are engaging in really egregious acts of property damage. One thing that I've heard from many Afrin residents is they talk about relatives or friends going back to find their houses and seeing that the windows and doors have been stolen out of the houses, fully taken out and taken, the armed group members and their relatives take them with them. So there's no organized effort to ensure that people get their properties and homes back, in proper condition, without this kind of theft and other criminal behavior. There's no organized effort by the state to ensure that those previously moved in return back to their regions, despite the article in the March 10th agreement between the SDF and the transitional government stating that they would work on the return of all displaced people. There's no support for returning Afrin residents to, if not fully regain, then at least recoup the cost of their stolen and destroyed properties. And while violations have gone down and security conditions have improved, they're not what they were prior to 2018, when under the autonomous administration, Afrin was one of the most peaceful and safest parts of Syria. So on the one hand, we're seeing progress. But on the other hand, much of that progress is haphazard and really going on at the initiative of the community in Afrin themselves. Now, the transitional government, they have said, in the March 10th agreement that they will work on just the returns of displaced people. In their initial meeting with the autonomous administration delegation, there were claims that they would establish a joint committee to work on the Afrin files specifically, but that committee has never been established. And they've recently announced that local Afrin residents will be able to join their general security forces, which obviously in theory is a very positive step for our residents of that community to be able to, play a role in providing security. But at the same time, they have not removed or even requested the removal of Turkish forces from Afrin. The Turkey-backed Syrian National Army militias that have been committing grave abuses against Afrin people for the past 7 years now, since 2018, have not been removed. Several leaders of these groups involved in serious violations in Afrin, including the leader of the Sultan Suleiman Shah division and the leader of the Hamza division, have actually been promoted in the Syrian army, which is something that many, victims and survivors from Afrin have registered serious complaints about. So I guess we can say in Afrin, the situation is really one step forward and two steps back. which is a shame because in the very beginning, people in Afrin were hopeful that the transitional government would be able to provide security and stability and improve the situation compared to what it was before. And they've lost a lot of that hope and goodwill through their handling of the Turkish occupation, the Syrian National Army, and their lack of support for safe and dignified returns.
You recently floated this really interesting idea on X, whereby you suggested that the Kurds, could or should trade Afrin and Serikani in the north, which were occupied by the Syrian National Army, the former opposition group, trade those two cities or regions for Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor in the east, with Damascus, basically. Can you, elaborate on this briefly? And do you think it's a realistic, idea? Like, would there be any chance of this actually happening in reality on the ground?
I think that the biggest obstacle to something like this is fundamentally the fact that Turkey would not allow it. But I think that if it were to be possible, an arrangement like this one that would see the SDF returning to Kurdish areas and or Kurdish majority, we should say, areas, and the transitional government coming into Arab majority areas could be a very valuable exercise in trust building, in supporting the return of displaced communities, and in implementing any kind of future decentralization model that would be agreed upon for all of Syria. For any such model to work, both sides have to be able to integrate their institutions with those of the other and work together, which obviously the entrance of the forces of one side into areas controlled by the other and civil administration of one side into areas controlled by the other would be an example of exactly how to do that in practice. It would mean that some of the governance issues that we've seen in both places could likely be resolved. There have been some grievances that people in areas like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor have with SDF governance in those areas. And we've spoken at length about the grievances that people in Afrin and Serikani, which were taken over by Turkey in 2018 and 2019, have with the governance of Turkey-backed militias that have now been incorporated into the new state. And so these changes could give both of those populations access to a system that might be closer to the one that they prefer, aid in the return of displaced persons from other parts of Syria to their homes. And in a situation like this one, wherein you had both sides working together on bridging their institutions and cooperating, and perhaps improved governance conditions or more public satisfaction with local authorities, I think that you could see some benefits. And so I think that this could be something that could be thought about seriously as a model for kind of test driving whatever deal or agreement or new system that both sides agree on in a final negotiation or agreement that they come to. But realistically, I think that the main impediment to something like this would be the fact that Turkey has shown no interest in withdrawing from Afrin and Serikania. And without that Turkish withdrawal, you just wouldn't be able to, one, put the area fully under the sovereignty of the government for it to make that decision about how it's administered, and two, really actualize any of these steps. So I think it's something that could be considered, but I don't see it necessarily being the easiest option. But it would solve many problems that people have.
Well, I agree that the situation in Syria is really very complex. Let's move to the regional dimension of what is happening inside Syria, with the country being a site of major geopolitical struggle and contestation between a number of regional countries, Turkey, Israel, Iran, and the Gulf as well. Recently, we heard Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan accusing the SDF, the Kurdish-led SDF, of being Israeli pawns. But is this true? Or, what's behind this kind of rhetoric coming from Ankara? What does Ankara seek to gain from framing the Kurds in this way?
Well, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey has had a sort of phobia of foreign backed separatism or division or support for, any of the components, the non-ethnic Turkish, communities living in the region. So when Hakan Fidan talks about, makes claims like this one, he's building on a long tradition of fear and paranoia in Turkish society, intended to justify authoritarian policies and military expansion. Now, that being said, the Turkish-Israeli competition for not only influence in Syria, but also regional hegemony is a real dynamic that is at play in the country. And it's driving many of Turkey's decisions, including their outreach to the PKK and their resumption of negotiations. They fear that as Israel tries to expand its power in the region, the possibilities for Israeli confrontation with Turkey or with Iran make it so that it's important for Turkey to get its Kurdish population on side, so to speak, and not have internal contradictions that Iran or Israel could potentially use to their own advantage. So at the same time as it's a sort of old fear in Turkish politics and society, it's also a very modern strategic consideration. At the end of the day, the Syrian Democratic Forces represent the interests of, themselves and their people. This is a force that, and the governing body that, came out of a very deep social base. You regularly meet, as I mentioned, people who organized covertly in the 1980s and 1990s, for Kurdish rights. You meet families who have had relatives, that fought with the Iraqi Kurdish revolution against Saddam Hussein's regime and with the PKK's uprising against Turkey as well. This Kurdish national sentiment, and, in the past 10, 15 years, this support for the multi-ethnic, multi-religious system of the autonomous administration has extremely deep social roots that exist because of the treatment of these communities by the Syrian state and by radical Islamist groups in more recent years that have attacked their regions. So, this isn't, I think there's a tendency in Washington to act like armed groups and political parties sort of fell out of the sky with no social or political or economic conditions creating them. And when you look at Syria with that lens, you will fundamentally be unable to understand why exactly actors make the decisions that they do. So the SDF represents the people of Northeast Syria who want to continue to speak their language, practice their religion, and the Kurdish political parties and movements in Northeast Syria represent in particular the Kurdish segment of that point of view that has existed for a long time and will exist until those rights are granted. So they're not a proxy of anyone. And while Turkey is very concerned about competing regional hegemonies, I believe that when they say things like this, they're mostly attempting to manufacture consent for and support for more military action.
Let's stay on the geopolitical dimension here a little bit more. We know that Israel, has forcefully intervened in southern Syria on a couple of occasions on the side of the Druze. They have bombed basically any, weapons, heavy weaponry from the former Assad regime across the country on a number of occasions. Iran also has a very deep interest in Syrian affairs, and by extension, also the pro-Iranian Iraqi Shia groups as well. Do you think that, given this deeper geopolitical interest in Syria, that this is something that makes Damascus and Ankara hesitant in terms of actually moving forward with a large scale military campaign against the SDF and the Kurdish majority parts of northern and northeast Syria?
That's a primary reason, certainly, why they are hesitant. Both know that if the civil war were to restart in Syria, and if there were a large-scale attack against the Northeast, that would absolutely mean the restart of the civil war, that all foreign actors that had previously been very invested in the outcome of the Syrian conflict would once again attempt to bend the situation to their interests. certainly Iran and Israel being two that would that have been acting, in the past month since the fall of the regime, and that would likely attempt to move further if there were greater instability. So that's absolutely a major motivating factor. They know that any instability will be taken advantage of. From Turkey's perspective, as I mentioned, Turkey's outreach to the Kurdish movement is happening, in part because they fear that in the event of regional conflict, that if there exists an organization like the PKK that not only has, thousands of well-trained, well-armed fighters, but extremely, capable and active political branches in many countries, if such an organization were to receive foreign support by Iran, by Israel, by any foreign actor, that this could pose real meaningful threats to Turkey and Turkish interests in the region. Now, the PKK has been very clear it doesn't want to take sides in any such regional conflict. And if you know anything about its ideology and, sort of way of thinking about governance, the type of states that exist in both Israel and Iran are not remotely the type of actor that it would necessarily, want to support. But at the end of the day, Turkey sees this possibility and has chosen to reopen negotiations because of it. And so I think by the same token, they don't want to give other actors this window of opportunity in Syria to increase their own status and also to challenge Turkey's role in Syria. And I might add here as well that for all of the Turkish threats against the Northeast and the SDF, we have a successful example of Turkey changing course on Kurdish autonomous governance. And that's the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is where I'm speaking to you from right now. In the beginning, Turkey did not want this region to be established. And now it has political and economic ties that are so strong as to actually be critiqued by many Iraqi Kurds who believed the region might be too dependent on Turkey. So Turkey has proven able to accept Kurdish autonomy before, and it's benefited from its relationship, with the Kurdistan region. So in Syria, there's a possibility that were Turkey to accept Northeast Syrian decentralization, local control of security and local governance, that it could have an extremely positive relationship and, not only deny Iran and Israel opportunities, but expand its own influence, among its former enemies as well. So this dynamic is absolutely a driving force here. And I think it's one of the things that might prevent conflict, as you said.
Let's finally look at the US policy with regard to what's happening in Syria and also Northeast Syria. The US and the Kurds, in particular, the SDF, and before that, the People's Defense Units or the YPG, have been basically in an alliance, in a close partnership for the past 11 years or so. And they have been jointly fighting ISIS, and they have been quite successful in terms of ending ISIS's territorial caliphate and also ensuring that the group would not re-emerge again. How do you see currently, after Assad's fall, U.S. policy in Northeast Syria or toward Northeast Syria? Is the U.S. approach strengthening or weakening the SDF's position?
What the US wants is very similar to what the SDF wants, which is for Syria to succeed and become a stable and prosperous country at peace with its citizens and the region. And US engagement and diplomacy has been absolutely crucial in really meaningful steps towards peace and stability, such as the ceasefire with Turkey at the Tishreen Dam, in the area between Kobani and Menbij, and in the achievement of that March 10th integration agreement between the transitional government and the SDF that recognizes Kurdish rights and calls for both parties, to work towards the integration of their institutions. So I think that the US has been overall approaching the situation in a way that is aligned with what people in northeast Syria want, and that its diplomatic efforts have been, valuable for the SDF and the people of the region as well. I think that there is a tendency to. You can cut this, right? If I restart that sentence.
Yeah,
Go
we
ahead.
can do that.
Sorry, there's one thing. Hold on, not an internet thing. Okay. I think that there has been a tendency in US policy to want to give the new government the benefit of the doubt. And while I understand where that comes from, certainly everybody should be happy to have a regime as brutal as Assad's regime out of power, that giving the benefit of the doubt to a government composed of religious fundamentalists and militias infamous for human rights violations, is something that simply is not strategic if you care about security and stability. So I think that there have been occasions where the US has been too open with its engagement. And I will say that after the massacres in Sueda, where it was clear both that the government had very little regard for the safety of minority communities, and also either little command and control over its own forces to prevent crimes or no willingness to prevent those crimes, neither of which is possible, that a government like this one might not be necessarily the most capable of leading a successful transitional phase to achieve the kind of stability and prosperity in Syria that the United States and, of course, the SDF, the people of the Northeast, and people in Syria as a whole would like to gain as a result from this process. So, we saw a bit of that perhaps too forgiving approach with certain comments from US envoy, Ambassador Tom Barrack, who, early on was saying that federalism didn't work in Syria and talking about how Syria had to be simply one nation, one flag, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. But after the Sueda situation, we noticed that he changed the tone of his comments. He said that, if Syrian people choose to have a federal system, that's up to them. And once again, the US has been, crucially involved in mediating the ongoing SDF-Damascus negotiations, which is very important for a peaceful solution and the implementation of the rights of, these different components of Syrian society. So I think at the end of the day, there's an alignment in interests here. And the only way in which conflict can be prevented and a Syria that is stable, peaceful, secure, and a good partner to the international community can be established is through these negotiations between Damascus and the SDF. Because if those negotiations succeed, that will prevent new conflict. It will lead to the best chance of the adoption of policies like decentralization, local control of security, and equal rights for all communities that will ensure internal peace and stability. And it will mean that the forces that so successfully partnered with the US to fight ISIS for 10 years will hopefully have an important place in the new armed forces, really making Syria, a regional leader in terms of its capabilities and connections to the international community. So there's a world of opportunity here if those negotiations succeed, not just for the SDF, not just for the new government, but for the US as well. And so I hope we'll continue to see engaged US diplomacy, and I hope that the US will learn from some of the perhaps unintended consequences of embracing the new authorities uncritically.
I think everyone interested in the fate of Syria and Syrian affairs would be very closely watching to see how the US policy on that country will evolve in the coming months and years. On that note, let's bring this episode to a close. Meghan, thank you so much for joining us today from the Kurdistan region of Iraq and for sharing your insights. Meghan Bodette is the Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington, D.C., and a longtime observer of Kurdish and Syrian affairs. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of GeoSpace.